Okay, hello everyone, my name is Erin COF, and tonight I'm going to be talking about the effects of biofuels. My claim is that using biofuels in place of fossil fuels has an equally negative impact on our ecosystems. And in case anybody doesn't know, a biofuel is a solid, liquid, or gas fuel derived from recently dead biological material, and a fossil fuel is any combustible organic material such as oil, coal, or natural gas derived from long-dead material. And finally, an ecosystem is a system formed by the interaction of a community of organisms with their environment, which is going to include both animals and people. And to prove my claim, I'm going to address three secondary points. Number one, biofuels negatively affect the environment. Number two, biofuels will increase food shortages. And number three, biofuels are inefficient. And to begin with number one, biofuels negatively affect the environment because producing biofuels emits greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. And greenhouse gases are dangerous because they're not necessarily bad, but too much of the greenhouse gases can contribute to global warming. And a main argument for biofuels is that they're carbon neutral, meaning any CO2 that they add to the atmosphere they take away. But proponents of biofuels do not address the fact that producing biofuels emits greenhouse gases. And a study by Joe Fargione, a regional scientist for the Nature Conservancy, says that converting rainforests, peatlands, savannas, or grasslands to produce biofuels in Brazil, Southeast Asia, and the U.S. creates a biofuel carbon debt, meaning it adds CO2, by releasing 17 to 420 times more CO2 than the fossil fuels that they replace. So biofuels are carbon neutral if you're only considering the use of them, but if you take into account the production of them, then they're no longer carbon neutral. Secondly, it's better to plant trees than leave them. If you plant a tree, then it can absorb CO2, but if you cut it down, it no longer absorbs the CO2. So instead of planting them and tearing them down later on to make room for croplands or to use the trees for production of biofuels, they should just be left. And finally, for this point, biofuels emit different types of greenhouse gases than fossil fuels that can be more damaging. Environmental reporter Lewis Smith of the Times writes that rapeseed and corn biodiesel were calculated to produce up to 70% and 50% more greenhouse gases respectively than fossil fuels. He continues, stating that the concerns were raised over the levels of emissions of nitrous oxide, which is 296 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than CO2. So biofuels may not emit CO2, but they do emit other greenhouse gases that can be even worse than the CO2. And moving on to point number two, biofuels will increase food shortages. Crops such as corn are used in the production of biofuels like ethanol. David Swenson, an associate scientist in economics at Iowa State University, writes, current ethanol production and new ethanol plant development in the U.S. are concentrated in the Corn Belt states of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, and Nebraska. Those states alone produced nearly 62% of the nation's corn in 2006. Those same states account for about 2/3 of actual or planned ethanol production capacity. So if these states are going to be dedicating 2/3 of their 62% this would mean that 41% of that would be going to producing ethanol fuel, whereas only 21% will go towards food. And CNN.com published an article stating that over 450 pounds of corn are needed to fuel a 25-gallon tank with ethanol, which is enough calories to feed a person for a year. So it's clear that making ethanol fuel is kind of a waste of the corn that could be used to feed people who don't have food. And finally, my third point is biofuels are inefficient. First of all, it takes time to convert to a biofuel economy. And on top of the fact that it takes time, it also requires fossil fuels to convert to biofuels, because currently, if machines that are used to plow the fields and everything are powered by fossil fuels. So even if you were trying to convert to a biofuel economy, you're still dependent on those fossil fuels. So the fossil fuels are still adding the CO2 to the atmosphere. And secondly, biofuels require more energy than they produce. Cornell University researcher David Pimentel concluded in his 2005 study that producing ethanol from corn required 29% more energy than the product itself is capable of generating. This means that you would have to make more of the biofuel to do the same amount of work that gasoline already does. So it goes back to the same thing where you would have to use more of the fossil fuels, which adds more CO2, and it's a big circle of using fossil fuels to make biofuels, which emit CO2, and then using biofuels, which emit other greenhouse gases. So it all adds up. So in conclusion, biofuels have a negative effect on the environment, they add to the food shortage, and they're inefficient. And fossil fuels are not necessarily better than biofuels, but it would be more productive to investigate different alternatives instead of wasting time and damaging the environment by using biofuels. Thank you.
All right, Erin, propositions very clearly labeled. There's an excellent layout of the secondary points. You signpost them as you get to them. Everything's phrased appropriately as a claim of fact. Your supporting material on the first point was excellent, and I thought you had good explanations there. On the second point, I think you're missing a key piece of information about the amount of biofuels being produced, that there's a limit to the food production. I know you're over there somewhere. There you go, in the back corner. So, for instance, it doesn't matter if it takes 450 pounds to fill an engine. You say, well, that's a year's worth of calories. But if we have a surplus amount of those calories, then what does it matter? That's what you need to show, that there's a limit on what we can produce, and that if those limits are met and half of it's going to biofuels, then there would be food problems. That's kind of a key link in the arguments that's missing. On the third point, I think you've got a couple of interesting arguments. The transition argument might in fact be true, but there's no quantification on it. We don't know how long it would be, so I'm not sure how convincing it was. I thought you did a very good job citing your sources, providing good evidence. You slowed down to try and cover the numbers pretty reasonably well, and that's, good job. Thank you.